So poetry is not some kind of special, type of literature as far as I'm concerned. A poem is simply a story packaged differently, just like a novel is a story packaged differently. Drama, a story packaged differently. So the thing that these genres have in common is the story, and we'll come back to that at some point.
Greetings, apreneurs. Recently, I did an interview with my favorite Guyanese author, Ric Couchman, who has just released a new book, The Little Boy from Water Street. It's a Caribbean literature book, and he's going to be dedicating all proceeds from this book to raise up other Caribbean authors and storytellers. And so I sat with Ric Couchman for an interesting conversation. And from that conversation came different perspectives on the art of storytelling and just understanding his own development as a writer, as an author. And so the conversation was so interesting and so much to learn that I decided to put that in a two-part episode. And so today you're going to hear part one of that conversation with Ric Couchman, who has been an author mentor for me. And I trust that you will find it inspiring. Spread the word, get the book. And so it's two parts: The Art of Storytelling with Ric Couchman. Greetings, entrepreneurs. Welcome to the Authorpreneur Secrets podcast, the show that uncovers the secrets to win with books beyond book sales and dominate entrepreneurship. Through exclusive author interviews, stories, and must-have resources, you will discover some of the secrets and strategies to thrive with books and generate lasting income. I invite you to become an Authorpreneur ambassador and join me in my mission to raise up 10,000 Caribbean entrepreneurs by 2030. Spread the word about the podcast and encourage more people to increase their impact and income with books beyond book sales. Without further ado, let's get into the show. It's episode 144 of the Authorpreneur Secrets podcast. I'm your host, C. Ruth Taylor, and in today's show, we are continuing the series that we started about writing and retirement. And I have with me my favorite Guyanese author. The Guyana graphic describes Ric Couchman as a teacher, author, poet, blogger, and much more. He was born in Georgetown, Guyana. He has a background in theology, literature, and philosophy. He's a retired educator and former dean at the Robert Louis Stevenson School in New York, where he worked for 26 years before retiring. He enjoys living, laughing, and loving, and sees nature as his playground. Freedom, thought, and creativity are all sacred to him. Without further ado, welcome to the show, Ric.
Thank you very much for having me on, Ms. Taylor.
This is a pleasure. And so, entrepreneurs, if you see me fangirling, as I said, this is my favorite Guyanese author. And in my latest book, Carissa's Second Chance, is dedicated to him. And I pay tribute to him for encouraging me on my author journey. I think we've known each other for about 10 years, Ric, because I remember sending you my outline as I wrote the first book and asking you to edit it. And so it's been a 10-year journey. Can you imagine that?
Yeah, and I remember the time we also spent some time together in Potcar, Poets of the Caribbean, I think.
That's exactly how we met.
Yeah.
It's because of Potcar, chaired by the now Dr. Alan Pearson, Cynthia
That's right.
Alan Pearson.
Those were really good times.
Excellent. So I just want to pay tribute to you. It's really an honor, to be able to talk to you because you have a wide understanding of literature. You taught it, and philosophy, and you have fiction, to nonfiction. You're a poet, and so you write different kinds of genre. And so it's good to learn from you. And again, thank you for encouraging me on my author journey, and just being a strong support.
It's my pleasure.
It's the first, father-daughter thing on the podcast, because a year ago I interviewed your daughter, Imani, How to Have It All, about that book. And today we're going to talk about The Little Boy from Water Street, your latest novel. So congratulations on putting that out. All right. So, Ric, let's get into it. I like to promote the Caribbean on this podcast. And so, what's your favorite thing about Guyana that you believe persons need to know or would be interested in if considering a visit to Guyana?
For me personally, my favorite thing about the homeland is its diversity. It's racial diversity. It's cultural diversity, the religious diversity, and I think it is that diversity that really sort of laid the foundation for who I am today, especially the religious foundation. Now, when I say the religious foundation, I'm not speaking in terms of my own personal religious aspirations or worldview or anything like that. Interestingly, in the Caribbean, religion has played and still plays a very, very important part of who we are, and so because of Guyana's religious diversity, where we have the three major religions, Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism. I mean, I was right in the midst of it all as a child, and it certainly they all made an impact on me, and essentially sort of determined who I am today, as it were. As far as its attraction for people who have never been to my homeland, physically it's a really beautiful place, especially its rainforest. And I'm a woods type of person. I love being in the outdoors, especially in forest lands. And from that standpoint, it's really beautiful. But nothing more beautiful than its people. It's where I'm from. It's that from which out of which I came, and so it has a lot of meaning for me as a country.
Awesome. I've never been to Guyana, so one day I hope to visit that English-speaking country in South America. All right. So talk to us about your journey in writing and becoming an author.
Well, my journey was more in reading, not writing. Writing was not part of my journey at all. My earliest memory of any significant writing was when I was in third standard. And I remember writing a 2-page story titled Lost in the Jungle. And I believe that that piece of writing was influenced by a book I had read at the time titled Coral Island by an author whose name Ballantyne, I believe is the name. It's a long time ago. And that's it really resonated with me. And so it inspired me to want to do something, likewise about, a little boy sort of lost in the jungle and has to survive. And Coral Island has to do with some kids who were marooned on an island somewhere in the Caribbean, and so that really inspired me. And I wrote this 2-page short story and showed it to my teacher, and she was so taken aback by what I had written that she went about the school, showing it to the other teachers, and lauding my writing ability at the time, and that really meant a lot to me. But then that was it. After that, going in high school, writing became very, very tedious, and I really didn't like it because most of the times when you wrote something, back in the day, teachers would mark it up with red ink, and when I saw that, I was really turned off by it, and that was like, oh, you in my mind, your writing is not that good. So I basically got turned off from writing as such, and really grew to hate it, as it were, because I found it to be very innovating, very, very, it taxing on the mind, especially on my mind in particular. And so I really had no interest in it. But what was happening, because of my voracious appetite for reading, I think I was developing a sense of style and sort of sense of literature. And so what I was having done for me was that the writers to whom I was exposed, they were providing models of good writing, and I grew up with the classics, in particular, steeped in Western literature, and I really, really got into reading, and so without my realizing it, I had within me that sort of model that I had received from all these different writers, from different places. And it was only until I got to, tertiary level education that I began to realize that, whoa, I can do this thing very well. I still hated it, but, and then it was, I think in my 30s, I started sort of writing poetry. It just one day I just decided to write something. I was moved by a leaf falling to the ground. You're sitting in the outdoors, and I saw this leaf. It was autumn, and it was falling to the ground. And I wrote a poem about this leaf falling to the ground. And then I realized, wow, this is, there's something there. And so I started writing poetry, but the kind of poetry that I wrote was, it was more or less story based. There's always a story back of the poem, the particular poem that I might have written. So for me, poetry was not some kind of special genre or anything like that. It was just another form of storytelling, albeit a more condensed form of storytelling, in which it is sort of packed with emotions, like honey, where everything is just packed into this one sort of package of words, and when you read it, it's just bursting forth with emotions. And so that was how my writing evolved as such. I don't consider myself a writer. In fact, I don't like to be called an author or a writer, because that's sort of defining somebody. What I am is someone who writes. That's it. And someone who hates writing. That's it too. So, and I've written a few books, and that's the most that I would say as far as my writing is concerned.
Okay, that's an interesting journey. And it goes to show the impact of teachers. And as an educator, you can appreciate the impact of our teachers. We both are educators, trained educators.
Certainly,
Yeah.
certainly.
And so I'm happy about that. You talked about in your 30s, you started writing poetry. Well, I started writing poetry earlier. In my 20s, I used to write poems, turn them into postcards, and then sell them. So I was
Right.
an author entrepreneur from early without even recognizing it. And then when I was 33 was when I wrote my first manuscript,
Right.
Hearty Queen Unshackled, the one that I reached out to you about.
Yeah.
And
That was fantastic work, by the way.
and then I published it, when I was 34. I'm curious to know, from writing that poem to actually producing a book of poetry, because your first four publication at least were poetry books. Why did you decide to venture into poetry first?
Well, why did I decide to venture into poetry? I don't think it was a decision to, it was a conscious decision or anything like that. I have to go back a little bit to high school. I had the teacher who influenced me as far as appreciation of literature is concerned. It's a woman, her name Marjorie Cambridge. She was my literature teacher in high school. And she brought a kind of excitement and passion to literature. And this was, as far as I'm concerned, high school was not a time for learning. High school was a time for play, hanging out with friends and stuff like that. But in her class, she really engaged me, and I suppose the other students as well. But for me in particular, she got me curious about stories, basically. And one of the vehicles for conveying stories is poetry. So poetry is not some kind of special type of literature. As far as I'm concerned, it is simply a poem is simply a story packaged differently, just like a novel is a story packaged differently. Drama, a story packaged differently. So the thing that these genres have in common is the story, and we'll come back to that at some point. And so, in my literature class, when we were doing our, sort of the poetry section, I came across poems such as Matthew Arnold's Sohrab and Rustum. I would never forget that ever. This is a poem about a father and son. This father, his wife gives birth to a son, and she becomes afraid that if she tells her husband that he's gotten a son, because this is a war culture, a culture of warriors and stuff like that, that the father would train the son to become a warrior. And she didn't want the son becoming a warrior. So what she did, she told her husband that she did not give birth to a son, but she gave birth to a daughter. And so the father's like, what? Okay, give her away. So the son was sent to some faithful servant who took care of, the man and his wife, they took care of the prince. And what ended up happening anyway is that the prince got exposed to warfare and himself became a great warrior. And so he wanted to meet, and he heard about this great Rustum, and he wanted to meet his father because the great Rustum, right? And so he decides that, okay, I want to seek audience with the great Rustum. And so Rustum says, when Rustum heard that, this young kid wants to meet up with him, he says, what? How dare anyone, a kid come to try to meet with the great Rustum, Oh, hell no, it's not happening. but the young man was persistent, and it turned out that the only way he could get a meeting with his father was to take on a persona of someone else and to challenge his father to battle. And the father, is like, of course, he doesn't know that this is his son who is doing that. And the father says, you know what, this is some little kid who wants to get fame at my expense. It's not going to happen. I'm not accepting the challenge. The young man persisted and he persisted and he persisted. And eventually Rustam said, okay, let's do it. I'm going to teach this young man a lesson. And so here the young man meets his father. He loves his father. He's proud of his father. He wants to show his father that, hey, look what I've become, but the father, is so in his own head, he just, wants to fight this youngster and teach him a lesson. And so the fight starts, and Sohrab is trying not to fight because, hey, this is my dad I'm fighting. But then, Rustam is really laying it on, and Sohrab is not really defending, but he's not really fighting back. And then Rustam delivers a decisive blow. And as the kid lays dying, he tells Rustam, I'm your son, Sohrab. And he's like, no, what are you talking about? I don't have a son. And he shows him the seal on his arm, which shows that, right? Now, imagine, I was going to say, imagine a youngster hearing something like that, right? Well, this is me because my imagination is just off the charts. And so as Miss Cambridge is sort of going over this poem with us, it's like, I'm sort of like in it. It's like I'm in the theater. I'm in the cinema. I'm like, whoa, And by the way, this is packaged in poetry, right? Now, the language of poetry is also very elevated, right? So I'm getting that, but I'm getting the story. It's like I said, it's the story, right? And I'm like, whoa, and the moment of recognition by Rustam and of his son, that poem left an impression on me, Miss Taylor. And then so there are others like the Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, right? Which the Morte d'Arte by Lord Alfred Tennyson. You have John Gilpin, The Highwayman, right? These are all stories packaged in poetic form, So that has been my experience. So I'm taking all this stuff in. My intent was not to write poetry or write anything. All I was interested in doing was simply enjoying the darn experience, and that's it, right? And then, like I said, one day I'm sitting, under a tree or something like that, and I see a leaf falling, and then the next thing I know is that these words are coming, and it's sort of sounding like the kind of language that I read and heard, like when I was a teenager in high school, and I'm like, wow, so that was where that came from. And so I started writing, and it just came sort of like automatically, you know what I'm saying? Like it was there latent. And so what I did, though, I continued with if you read most of my poems, I would say 90% of my poems, in fact, all of my poems, there's a story in there, right? It's nothing cryptic, because people think that, poetry is something cryptic, and that is so not the truth. Well, some people do write cryptic poems. What's the point of it? I don't know. But words must mean what they say. And the words in my poetry, in my poems, they mean what they say. There's nothing cryptic about it. What people just need to have is at least some wide array of exposure to literature. And what they'll find is that there are lots of allusions to other works of literature. Because I'm so steeped in it, I can't help myself but use allusion as a literary device to sort of move the story along. Sorry, I got carried away. Yeah.
That's fascinating, and it makes perfect sense that your first set of books would have been poetry because the art form captured your imagination as a
Yeah.
child. And that's the first I've ever heard poetry described as such. I've not been exposed formerly when we were doing literature. I hated, going through the poems and, having to try to dissect what is happening and what meaneth this. And so hearing you talk about, it's
Yeah.
it's it's a narrative, it's a story
Right.
expressed in a different art form makes it more palatable, makes it more attractive, and like, oh, I can do that with poetry. And so yeah, and it makes sense, you know.
Yeah.
Before we get into The Little Boy from Water Street, your latest work, what are the first set of books that you wrote? I know I have A Famine of Tears and Musing from Outside Universal. What are the other poetry books that you
Well,
have written?
A Famine of Tears is basically the first of a trilogy, poetic trilogy. So it's A Famine of Tears, Blueprint for a Nihilism, and Conflagration of Uranus. Right now, I don't waste words. Every time, every word, every phrase, every sentence that I use, has a meaning, has a purpose. There's something to it, and I don't. My works are not widely read, but the trilogy that I just spoke of, A Famine of Tears, I think there's a subtitle to it, the way that leads nowhere, and then Blueprint for a Nihilism, the truth that subjugates, and the Conflagration of Uranus, the life not worth living. Now, any person who is well read and or widely read. I mean, I don't want to say well read because that's sort of judgmental. I'm not judging or anything like that. But any person who is read widely would at least pick up something about that, right? Way, 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 the way. That now, my background is I have a very solid background in evangelical Christianity, Hinduism, and then Islam. And so my background influences my process and my worldview. And so the trilogy, A Famine of Tears, Blueprint from Nihilism, and Conflagration of Uranus, the subtitle is certainly a play on I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one coming unto the Father but by me. So I did something else with. So if you look at it, the way that leads nowhere, the truth that subjugates, and the life not worth living. The way, the truth, and the life. Now, right. See, everything mean what they say, right? That's my thing. There's nothing cryptic or anything like that, but they sort of wide reading would at least help with some basic understanding of these. But anyway, so the trilogy, and then I wrote 3 a.m. That's the devil's hour. and I think, and then of course there was my first book of poetry, Musings from Outside the Universal. Now, I did not intend to publish anything, but a dear friend of mine, a very good friend of mine, who is a publisher himself, he encouraged me to publish that first book of poetry, and that's a sort of a Kindle type book, and that's my bastard child. The music from outside Universal.
I think it's the only Kindle book that's there. Everything else is in paperback.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Why do you call it your bastard child? My
It's
first
not the one that it's
yeah.
like I said, my intent was not to be published or anything like that, but this my friend thought that the poems in there were
Worthy of
really,
publication.
yes. I didn't think so. So
So you got pushed into purpose of putting
yeah,
your
yeah,
material out there.
yeah.
My first book, I know you loved it and you gave it
I
a
remember it
raving
very
review.
well. I remember it very well. And
Yeah, it's one of those books that for many years, it took me about 10 years to really accept it.
yeah,
I mean, I wrote the script. I'm 43 now. I wrote the script when I was 33. But having published it, I was like, TMI, I've shared too much information about myself in this. And sometimes I would read it and I would be like, ugh, why did you say that? And
yeah,
interestingly, people have always come and said, I like this book. I value the transparency and the vulnerability. And there are times when persons have said, you really said a lot in that book. And I'm like, I was dating a guy once, and one of my mentors said, did you read your book? And the way how he asked that, I was like, okay, what does that mean? Is that a liability or an asset now? So that was almost my bastard child, but it really became the platform for everything
yeah,
we now do.
yeah,
So it really, perhaps, they say your first book is not your best book, but in terms of what it has done for my understanding of authorship and leading me into publishing, I really am happy that despite the
yeah,
but for the role that it has played, because it was the catalyst. So
yeah, yeah.
definitely. All
Oh, I
right.
do remember. I remember that book very well.
And coming from a literature teacher, I was like, oh, but Rick likes this.
Oh,
Oh,
yeah.
so because in Podcar, I think it's Samuel Mann.
Yes.
In his review of The Famine of Tears, he calls you like the dean of Podcar, and he had these, he sang your praises quite well. So I was like, if this person could read my book and commend it the way he did, that means it's not so bad. And I do have a flair for writing then. And so that started to help me to really believe in my writing ability. It took a while. I mean, despite you telling me,
Yeah, yeah.
you're good at this, you have something here. It really took a while. And let's talk about the move from writing poetry to writing, I think it's literary nonfiction. And then the latest work is a literary fiction. And so I'm wondering, did you, as you use the term, step outside the universal in the last set of books, or was it just continuing the trajectory? I'm asking a lot of questions, but give us a drop to that phrase, because I borrowed it for the last book, and I noticed in The Little Boy from Water Street, you also have it in the book description and in the book. That phrase, stepping outside the universal, what does it mean? What's the story behind that? And then let's get back
Yeah.
the last two books.
And it's interesting that you picked up that you observe the phrase elsewhere in my books. That's one of the other things about how I write. If anyone decides, "Hello, I want to read everything Ric Couchman has written," right? What that person will observe is that, wow, it's like a network among the books. The themes are, you get the themes in various ways, in all the books, and there are certain phrases, and there's certain, so there's continuity among these books, and that's my style basically, and that's my link with successive works. Now, the term "stepping outside the universal," it's an existential term. It's not simple. It's not as simple as moving from poetry. Sorry, from so-called nonfiction to fiction or anything like that. It's deeper than that. It's an existential thing. And it's in that. Well, first of all, let me say where it's not original with me. I got that from Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher and theologian, who happens to be my favorite theologian and philosopher, basically, who has influenced my own journey significantly.
I trust that you enjoyed listening to part one of this very interesting conversation with Ric Couchman on the art of storytelling and his own author journey. Join us next week for part two of the art of storytelling, a conversation with Guyanese author Ric Couchman. Just reminding you that of the making of books, there is no end. Go pen it to win it and dominate entrepreneurship. Ta for now, until next time.